Can you translate this for us?
Él dice que acepta los términos del contrato.
Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm really hoping to break through the magical barrier of 1,000 subscribers. That number holds a special significance for me. Hit that subscribe button. It's just one click, but for me, it's a huge boost of motivation to create my next video. Thank you in advance. Valentina shouldn't have stayed. They'd told her to leave 10 minutes ago, to grab her things, to hand in her badge, to cause no further trouble. Sebastian Mora hadn't called her into an office. He'd stopped her in the service hallway, in front of 2 waiters and a supervisor, who'd lowered her gaze the moment she heard his name. He'd said it in that low voice certain men use when they want to humiliate without effort. "We don't need employees who have opinions." And she had nodded. She'd taken her bag from the locker. She'd walked towards the exit, done everything a person is supposed to do when they've just been fired from the only job they had. But then she heard something from the hallway, a phrase in French, and the translation that followed wasn't even close to what that phrase had said. Valentina Cruz was 34 years old, her dark hair still pulled back in the severe bun of her shift, the blue uniform with white trim so washed it was fraying at the elbows. She'd spent 18 months working in private corporate event catering on the 42nd floor of the Alcantara Tower, 18 months carrying trays, learning to be invisible, learning to move without making a sound among men who never met her eyes. 18 months paying the rent for a small apartment in Tepito, where she lived with her mother and her younger sister, who was studying nursing at the public university, and depended on that money as much as she depended on air. They'd fired her because she'd asked a question, nothing major. She'd only asked why, on her April bi-weekly paycheck, she was short 400 pesos. 400. Sebastian, the shift manager, a 50-year-old man with an expensive watch and the habit of not finishing sentences when he spoke to service staff, had told her it was an administrative adjustment. Valentina asked for it to be explained in writing. Sebastian wrinkled his mouth as if he'd bitten something bitter. "In writing, why?" she insisted calmly, without raising her voice, with that quiet firmness her mother had taught her. Truth doesn't need shouting to be true. They'd fired her the next day. Reason, problematic attitude. That had been 40 minutes ago. And now Valentina stood in the service hallway, her bag slung over her shoulder, her badge already returned, listening through the ajar door of the private room, as a man named Leclerc said something in French to a table full of businessmen, and as the translator rendered those words into something entirely different. Valentina knew French because her father had spoken it. A man who had arrived from Haiti at 20 with a small suitcase, who had worked in kitchens and warehouses for 3 decades, who had taught her the language as a gift. Her father had died 4 years ago. What remained of him, besides memory, was that language Valentina carried in silence, without telling anyone, because in the places where she worked, speaking more languages didn't change the salary or the treatment. Leclerc had said, "We are here because we believe in the potential of your communities. This investment is not charity, it is a genuine, long-term bet." A translator had said the risk level was very high, and that before committing, they needed additional guarantees from local partners. Valentina stood still, listened again, waited for the next sentence. Leclerc spoke again, more calmly, outlining general terms. He mentioned jobs, mentioned deadlines, mentioned results in Colombia and Peru. The translator said that Mr. Leclerc expressed reservations about the country's regulatory stability and could not commit to dates until an independent audit was received. It wasn't a mistake. Mistakes have a different rhythm. This was deliberate, sustained, rehearsed. She peeked through the door. The private room was exactly what you'd expect from the 42nd floor of a building like this. A gleaming black table, dark leather chairs, windows overlooking the city alight at night. At the head, the CEO of the Mexican company, Rodrigo Anza, 38, brown hair with a touch of controlled disarray, his tie loosened by barely a centimeter, the jaw of someone who had been negotiating for hours. Beside him, Hector Fuentes, legal partner, salt and pepper hair and glasses, taking notes without looking up. And opposite them, Philippe Leclerc, the French businessman who had flown in from Lyon, a man in his 60s with the calm of someone who doesn't need to prove anything. And there, between the two groups, the translator, Claudio Reyes, didn't seem nervous. That was the problem. He translated with perfect confidence, as if he had rehearsed every lie before entering the room. A gray suit, slicked back hair, a smile that appeared and disappeared depending on the camera he was facing. He wasn't improvising, he was constructing. Valentina watched Rodrigo Ansa frown at what he had just heard. She saw Leclerc observe the reaction of the table with a slightly confused expression, as if the atmosphere didn't match what he had said. The deal was falling apart, and no one in that room knew it, except the man in the gray suit and, now, an employee who didn't even work there anymore. Valentina had her bag. She had the exit door 12 meters away. She had a mother waiting for her and a sister who needed the money to keep coming in. She had absolutely no reason to stay. Where are you watching this story from? Write it in the comments. We care about knowing where in the world this community comes from. And yet, she stayed put. She breathed. She thought of the 400 pesos that had been stolen from her, as if they were nothing. She thought of Sebastian's face, saying, "Problematic attitude," as if asking for an explanation were a disease. And she thought of how many people depended on the agreement they were destroying in there, phrase by phrase, with the quiet precision of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. She pushed the door open and walked towards the table. The room fell silent when they saw her enter. A 34-year-old woman in a blue uniform, without a badge, her bag slung over her shoulder, crossing the space with a calm none of those present knew how to interpret. Sebastian appeared from the back of the room as if shot. "Miss Cruz, you no longer work here. You must leave immediately." The voice was a furious whisper. Valentina didn't look at him. She approached Rodrigo Ansa, leaned in slightly, brought her hand near his ear without touching it, and spoke so low only he could hear. "Your translator is lying." Rodrigo didn't turn immediately. He just stopped moving his fingers on the table. The phrase entered his ear like a warning, not an interruption. Then, slowly, he turned towards Valentina. She met his gaze without blinking. "What did you say?" His voice was low, controlled, but something in it had changed. "I'm telling you that what Mr. Leclerc is saying in French is not what your translator is communicating to this table." Sebastian arrived from behind like a small storm. "This is your final warning. If you do not leave now, I will call security, and this will end very badly for you." He took her arm with a firmness that was meant to be discreet, but which no one in the room failed to notice. Valentina pulled away without drama. "You can call whoever you want, but first, allow me to show you what I mean." Rodrigo Ansa looked at Sebastian, then at Valentina, then at Claudio, who had risen with a professional smile and slightly tense shoulders. The kind that isn't noticeable unless you know where to look. "One moment," Rodrigo said, raising a hand towards Sebastian. Sebastian stopped. Hector Fuentes looked up from his notebook for the first time. Felipe Leclerc watched from the other side of the table with that expression of men accustomed to reading situations. Attentive, still, waiting. Claudio cleared his throat. "Excuse the interruption, Mr. Ansa. I don't know what this young lady is looking for, but if you'll allow me, we'll continue. We have important matters pending." "Yes," Rodrigo said. "That's why I want to hear her." Claudio opened his mouth, then closed it. Rodrigo turned to Valentina. "Do you speak French?" "Yes." "And you say the translations are incorrect." "I say they are incorrect, and I say the difference is not minor." Rodrigo switched to English, the language they both shared with Leclerc. "Monsieur Leclerc, I apologize for the interruption. Would you mind repeating your last statement?" Leclerc nodded, his composure intact. He spoke in slow French. "Of course." Valentina translated aloud, directly, without looking at Claudio. The room took 3 seconds to react. Hector Fuentes dropped his pen onto his notebook. One of the businessmen at the back let out a barely audible sigh. Rodrigo Ansa said nothing. He just slowly turned towards Claudio Reyes. Claudio tried to smile. "There are several ways to interpret what Mr. Leclerc said. My version is equally valid from a technical standpoint." "No," Rodrigo said. A single word, unadorned, with no visible anger. But something in his tone made Claudio close his mouth halfway through his next sentence. Leclerc had said, "We are here because we believe in the potential of this region. This investment is a genuine, long-term bet. We have built real jobs in other markets and want to do the same here." Claudio had translated that the risk level was considerable, and that before committing, they needed additional guarantees from local partners. It wasn't interpretation, it was something else. Rodrigo asked to verify the 3 previous translations. Valentina reproduced them from memory, phrase by phrase. Hector took notes in parallel. The exercise lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, there was silence in the room. Claudio attempted one last defense. He said there were cultural nuances. that simultaneous translation is an art, that a service employee should not be allowed to interrupt a negotiation of this magnitude. I am no longer an employee here, Valentina said. I was fired 40 minutes ago. Silence. Rodrigo looked at her. You were fired tonight? Yes, and yet you came back in. It wasn't a question. Rodrigo Ansa rose from his chair, walked over to where Claudio stood, and said something in his ear. Claudio listened, nodded very slowly, then gathered his notes, his half-empty glass of water, and left the room without looking back at anyone. The door closed with a soft sound. Rodrigo returned to his seat. He adjusted his tie by a centimeter. He looked at Valentina, standing by the table, her bag still slung over her shoulder. Please, sit down. If this story grabbed you from the first minute, it's because there's something in silent justice that moves us all. Stay, the best is yet to come. Valentina didn't sit immediately. She looked at the chair Rodrigo indicated, as if unsure the invitation was real. It was Claudio Reyes's chair, dark leather, high back, to the CEO's right, at the end of a table where no one with her uniform had ever sat before. Please, Rodrigo repeated. Valentina placed her bag on the floor and sat down. Sebastian Mora was still standing near the door with that expression of men who have just lost control of a situation and don't know how to process it. Rodrigo looked at him. Thank you, Sebastian. Please let kitchen know we'll need another half hour. It was an elegant way of telling him to leave. Sebastian understood. He left. The meeting continued. For the next 40 minutes, Valentina translated everything. Leclerc spoke, and she rendered his words into Spanish with unadorned precision, without adding, without softening, without hardening. Just the exact phrase, in the exact order, with the exact tone. Hector took notes, the others listened, and the meeting that was about to collapse slowly took another shape, like water finding its course again. Not everything was easy. Leclerc had real conditions, concrete deadlines, demands that were not small. Rodrigo asked direct questions and expected direct answers. There was a moment, about 20 minutes in, when Leclerc said something that visibly unnerved two of the Mexican partners. Valentina translated it exactly as it was. No sugarcoating. Rodrigo looked at her for a second. She held his gaze. He felt it, almost imperceptibly. This was how it was supposed to work. During a brief pause, as the attendees reviewed documents, Leclerc leaned towards Valentina and spoke to her in French, in a low voice. How long have you been working with them? Valentina hesitated. Tonight is the first time I've spoken with them. Leclerc looked at her with something that wasn't surprise but recognition. And why did you come in? Valentina thought for a moment. Because I was outside, and heard something that wasn't right, and I couldn't just keep walking. Leclerc nodded slowly. Good, one word. But Valentina felt that word carried more weight than many things she'd been told in the past 18 months. Rodrigo watched her from time to time with that discreet attention of someone piecing something together. Valentina noticed and said nothing. She was doing her job. That was what needed to be done. Towards the end of the first hour, Hector Fuentes called for a 10-minute break. The men stood up, some went into the hallway, others checked their phones. Rodrigo stayed at the table. Valentina did too. What's your name? He asked. Valentina Cruz. How long have you been here? 18 months? And no one knew you spoke French. No one asked. Rodrigo processed that. He looked at his glass of water for a moment. Why were you fired? She looked him straight in the eye. I asked for an explanation in writing about a deduction from my bi-weekly pay. How much did they deduct? 400 pesos. Rodrigo said nothing, but something shifted in his expression. It wasn't pity. It was more akin to the discomfort of someone suddenly grasping the true scale of something that had happened nearby without them seeing it. I have family. My mother and my sister. My sister studies nursing with her salary. It wasn't a question. Yes. Silence. Only the air conditioning and the city lights beyond the large window. Where does the French come from? Rodrigo asked. From my father. He was Haitian. She paused. He died 4 years ago. Did you study anything? International relations. 2 years. I had to leave. Why? She looked at him without looking away. Because life doesn't always wait for you to finish your degree. Rodrigo didn't reply. Hector Fuentes came back in. The others followed. The break was over. Where are you following me from? Write it in the comments. This story belongs to all of us who have ever had to choose between staying silent and telling the truth. But as everything progressed, at some point in the second hour, Valentina noticed something that made her uneasy. Claudio Reyes hadn't left the building. She saw him through the glass of the hallway, pacing from one end to the other with his phone to his ear, with that specific agitation of someone giving instructions. Anyone who had seen him without context might have thought he was simply an executive on a long call, but Valentina had learned to read people's movements in those hallways. She knew when someone was waiting and when someone was acting. Claudio was acting. She approached Hector Fuentes and told him in a low voice during the next break. Fuentes frowned. "Are you sure?" "Not completely, but I think you should know." Fuentes left without rushing. Valentina didn't know what happened next because the meeting resumed and she had to concentrate. But 15 minutes later, Claudio was no longer in the hallway. Near the end, Rodrigo received a message on his phone. He read it, his expression didn't change. He continued with the meeting. When they finally finished, when the preliminary documents were on the table, and the men were standing to say goodbye, Rodrigo approached Valentina. Claudio wasn't improvising, he said in a low voice, so only she could hear. He was placed here by a rival company to break the deal from the inside. 3 meetings with us, Cruz. This was the most important one. Valentina processed that. 3 meetings. All the damage that could have been done before tonight. How did you know so quickly? Hector made some calls. You alerted him. I just told him what I saw. Yes. Rodrigo looked at her. That's enough. The businessmen were saying goodbye to Leclerc. Handshakes, cards exchanged, the orderly hum of a meeting that had ended well. Valentina stood up. She picked up her bag from the floor and felt, for the first time that night, the real exhaustion of what she had done. It hadn't been dramatic, there had been no shouting, just a phrase whispered in an ear, a translation spoken aloud, and everything that followed. She walked towards the exit. Rodrigo called her from the table. Cruz. She stopped. Don't go yet. Leclerc approached her before Rodrigo could say anything else. He did so with the calm of someone who doesn't need to rush. He stood in front of Valentina, looked at her for a second, and extended his hand. She took it. Thank you, he said in French. Seriously, I didn't do anything extraordinary. Yes, you did. You did the right thing when you had no obligation to do so. That is precisely the opposite of ordinary. Valentina didn't reply. There was something in that recognition, spoken so plainly, that squeezed her chest in a way she hadn't expected. Leclerc left with his team. The room gradually emptied until only Rodrigo, Hector Fuentes, and Valentina remained standing by the door. Sit for a moment longer, Rodrigo said. Fuentes opened a folder, took out a document, reviewed it, and placed it in front of him. Do you know why Claudio lasted 3 meetings without anyone questioning him? Rodrigo began. Valentina waited, because no one at that table understood what was being said in the original language. We were completely dependent on him. We've spent 2 years building this alliance and we never saw that blind spot. Fuentes cleared his throat. There's a position that, until today, didn't exist in our company. Valentina looked from one to the other. International Communications Coordinator, Rodrigo said. It's not a made-up title. It's a real need that tonight showed us we have and hadn't seen. It requires languages you possess, discretion you've demonstrated, understanding the context of what's said, not just the words. And that's not something you learn in a course, Fuentes finished. Rodrigo mentioned a figure. Valentina looked up. It was more than triple what she earned on the 42nd floor. She didn't think of herself first. She thought of the overdue electricity bill on the kitchen table, her sister's bus fare to get to university, her mother pretending her knees didn't hurt so they wouldn't spend money on a doctor's visit. There's a 90-day probation period, Rodrigo continued, and there's an agreement with Ibero-Americana to finish the degree in a blended learning format. The company covers 70% for qualified collaborators. He looked directly at Valentina. You would qualify. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Valentina thought of her mother, her sister, the empty locker, the returned ID badge, Sebastian Mora saying conflicting attitude, as if asking for what was rightfully hers was a character flaw. She thought of her father, the language he had left her as a gift, without her knowing exactly what it would be for, of all the times she had mentally translated conversations that no one knew she understood, of all the places where she had been invisible, not because she had nothing to contribute, but because no one had been curious enough to ask. I need to think, Rodrigo said. He nodded. Of course. How much time do I have? Until Monday. It was Thursday. Valentina nodded, picked up her bag, and stood up. One question, she said before leaving. Rodrigo waited. Sebastian Mora. The building service department reports to him, correct? Rodrigo frowned slightly. Yes, On my April paycheck, 400 pesos were deducted without explanation. When I asked for it in writing, I was fired the next day. Fuentes jotted something in his notebook without being asked. Do you have the receipt? Rodrigo asked. On my phone. Send it to Hector before you leave. Valentina did it right there. In 30 seconds, Fuentes confirmed he had received it. Rodrigo looked at her as she put her phone away. Cruz! She looked up. Thank you. A single word, without the tone of someone thanking a subordinate for doing something beyond their duty. It was the gratitude between two people who had been in the same situation and resolved it together. Valentina nodded. She turned, walked across the room, and when she reached the door, she stopped for a second, not looking back. Monday, I'll confirm, she said, and left. If you found this fair, leave your like. Sometimes a like is the only way we have to say this matters. Monday arrived with rain. Valentina left her home in Tepito at 8 in the morning with her hair pulled back, a blouse she'd ironed the night before, and a folder with the documents Hector Fuentes had requested by email on Friday. She didn't have a uniform, she didn't have a service bag, she had her usual purse, the brown one with the zipper that was hard to open, and an address in Polanco she already knew by heart. Her mother had been awake when she arrived on Thursday night. She had heard her come in, she had come out of her room in her slippers and robe, and Valentina had told her everything. Sitting in the kitchen with the sound of the rain outside, and 2 cups of tea that neither of them finished. Her mother listened without interrupting. When Valentina finished, there was a long silence. And what are you going to do? She had asked. I already know what I'm going to do. Her mother nodded. She didn't ask anymore. On Friday, Valentina spent the day reading about the company. Grupo ANSA was bigger than she had thought. Operations in 4 countries, alliances with European and Asian companies, an infrastructure division that had spent 12 years building hospitals and schools in the southern states of Mexico. It wasn't just money. There was something there that pointed towards something concrete. On Saturday, her sister Diana arrived hungry and with questions. Valentina explained as they heated beans. Diana listened with that attention she had had since she was a child, the kind of person who processes everything before reacting. So, they fired you, and then you got a better job, she said? Not exactly, but something like that. And the French dad's thing? Valentina stirred the beans. Yes, dad's thing. That night, before falling asleep, Diana sent her a message. He would be proud. Me too. Valentina read it 3 times. Monday arrived with rain, and Valentina crossed the door of Torre Alcantara, for the first time without a uniform. She went up to the 42nd floor. This time, she didn't take the service elevator. The receptionist was waiting for her. She led her to a small meeting room, different from the private salon of the previous week. Hector Fuentes arrived punctually with the contract folder and a cup of coffee. They reviewed the terms. Valentina asked 2 questions. Fuentes answered both directly. She signed. When Fuentes left to make copies, Rodrigo ANSA entered. He hadn't announced he was coming, he simply appeared, with that habit he had of moving without making noise, despite being as present as he was. Everything in order, yes? Valentina said. Rodrigo sat down on the other side of the table. He looked like someone who had slept little, but he wasn't going to say it. Sebastian Mora resigned on Friday, he said, as a matter of fact, without emphasis. Valentina looked at him. Did he resign? Or was he asked to? Rodrigo paused minimally. Both, in that order. Valentina nodded. The deduction from your paycheck wasn't the only one. He continued. Fuentes found the same adjustment applied to 7 other female employees on the afternoon shift in the last 4 months. Mora had an arrangement with payroll administration. The reimbursements are being processed. Valentina thought of the other 7. Of how many of them had asked for explanations and hadn't insisted, because they knew what happened when they insisted. Are you sure you can track it properly? Rodrigo asked. It's already been tracked, she replied. Good. Rodrigo watched her with that particular intensity of his. Not one of judgment, but of a genuine desire to understand. May I ask you something? He said. Yes. On Thursday, when you walked into that room, were you afraid? Valentina considered the question, her gaze honest. Yes. And you went in anyway? Yes. Why? She thought of her father, of the language he had left her, of all the burdens carried unseen, of the 400 pesos, and of the 7 women who didn't yet know their names would appear on a refund statement. Outside, there was nothing left to lose. And inside, she said, there was something that couldn't be left as it was. Rodrigo nodded slowly. That's exactly what someone in the position we're offering needs. Fuentes returned with the signed copies, handing one set to each of them. The meeting concluded with a handshake, quiet and unceremonious. Valentina tucked her copy into her folder. As she stepped out of the room, the hallway was silent. Through the large windows, the city still glistened, wet from the rain. Buildings mirrored themselves on the asphalt, creating an inverted urban landscape. Valentina paused for a moment, gazing at the scene. She thought of all the times she had walked these corridors, used the service elevator, her hands full, her eyes downcast. She reflected on what is lost when one learns not to look, not to desire what one cannot have. And she thought about how sometimes the difference between one life and another is contained within a tiny moment, in a door one chooses to push open or leave shut, in a phrase spoken or held back, in the language a father teaches a daughter without knowing its exact purpose, but trusting that something so true will always serve some good. Valentina Cruz crossed the hallway, headed for the elevator facing the avenue, and descended. Because sometimes a life doesn't change when someone opens a door for you. It changes when, even in fear, you are the one who decides to push it. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If anything you've seen here has resonated with you, whether it's the initial injustice, the moment Valentina pushed that door open, or simply the idea that doing the right thing can change more than one life, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There are many more stories waiting on this channel. I'll see you in the next one.